This series is all about universes, multiverses, planets, worlds, continents and cities. We're delving not into specific games but into milieus created for them. We'll be looking at where these settings came from, their major features, and why you should consider them for your own gaming experiences. Episode 3 beckons with a literary world of pulp fantasy origin that has over the years been a part of the fantasy gaming scene and an influence upon it. Today we explore the world of Nehwon and its greatest city, Lankhmar. Our journey begins with two friends, Fritz Leiber and Harry Fischer. In 1934, the latter conceived of two heroes, a gentle giant northern barbarian named Fafhrd, who Fischer based on Leiber, and a short streetwise thief of mysterious origin, the Grey Mouser, who happened to dabble in a little of the black arts of sorcery, who Fischer took as an imaginary facsimile of himself. Fischer also conceived of the seedy city of Lankhmar and its surroundings, but did not make a connection between his two heroes and that land straight away. Leiber and Fischer created a war game together at university in 1937, which depicted the terrain of the world of Nehwon, and titled it Lankhmar, the later name of Lankhmar appearing further on, perhaps due to a fortunate error. I, for one, think that the name by which we know it has a far better ring than Lankhmar. The game was never published, but it did form part of the coalescing of ideas that bubbled away in the cauldron to eventually deliver the literary works and games that we know and love today. Two Sought Adventure was the first Fafhrd and Grey Mouser tale to reach publication in the August 1939 edition of Unknown magazine, a tale that would ultimately end up being published in book compilation form as The Jewels in the Forest. Several tales followed in the pages of Unknown, Fantastic, the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, and Other Worlds through the 1940s to the 1960s. While both Fischer and Leiber were responsible for creating the heroes and their world, Fischer did not contribute so much to the writing of their adventures. The first parts of the Lords of Quarmal, which was eventually completed by Leiber for publication in Fantastic in 1968, to which Fischer noted that he was happy to find out how his tale concluded, and The Childhood and Youth of the Grey Mouser, a short story published in the pages of Dragon magazine, issue 18 in 1978, being his only contributions. The entire saga of Lankhmar includes but a single full-length novel, The Swords of Lankhmar, expanded from earlier Leiber-penned tale, The Tale of the Grain Ships. From 1970, the stories of Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser began to be collected into sequential volumes, all of which contain swords in their titling. Fitting with Leiber's position as one of the major authors of the swords and sorcery genre, and the originator of that very term. This has served the entire sequence to be known as the Swords books by some, although I personally prefer the Lankhmar saga or the saga of Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. The series kicks off with Swords and Deviltry, which deals with how the two protagonists end up leaving their old lives and eventually meeting in the seedy, thief-ridden city of Lankhmar. Book 2 is Swords Against Death, also published in 1970. The next two collections were published prior to the first two, but chronologically make up the third and fourth volumes, Swords in the Mist and Swords Against Wizardry, both being published in 1968. Swords Against Wizardry is one of the most evocative in the series, particularly with the pages of the vertigo-inspiring Stardock, the table-turning two best thieves in Lankhmar, and the Lords of Quarmal. The story began by Fischer and completed by Leiber. Volume 5 in the series is the novel The Swords of Lankhmar, which was the book that introduced my young mind to swords and sorcery in the first place, and fantasy in general, ironically, or perhaps not so, coming to it before any of the arguably bigger hitters of the genre such as Howard and Tolkien. Swords and Ice Magic collects tales published within the first half of the 1970s, and itself was published in 1977. The final collection, The Knight and Knave of Swords, arrived in 1988 and collected the final tales written by Leiber through to the end of the 1970s and into the 1980s. Fritz Leiber died in September of 1992 from a stroke, and thus one of the Grand Masters of swords and sorcery left us for his own Shadowland. A final volume in the series, published by White Wolf in 1998 as Swords Against the Shadowland, was authored by Robin Wayne Bailey. Although some editions of this label it as the 8th volume of the Lankhmar series, it actually falls somewhere between Swords and Deviltry and Swords Against Death. In my opinion, it is an unnecessary addition to the series, with no disrespect to Mr. Bailey. The original tales sufficiently cover the history of the Grey Mouser and Fafhrd from first meeting to, more or less, a happy ending on their own. The entire series, Bailey's work aside, has been published many times by many publishing houses. Currently, paperback editions of the 7 collections can be found collected themselves within the Fantasy Masterworks series, as Volume 18, the first book of Lankhmar, which collects Swords and Deviltry, Swords Against Death, Swords in the Mist, and Swords Against Wizardry, and Volume 24, the second book of Lankhmar, which collects the Swords of Lankhmar, Swords and Ice Magic, and the Knight and Knave of Swords. The entire series is also available on Kindle and on Audible, and various parts of it have been adapted into comic books. The travesty is, no TV series or movie as yet. Well, let's backtrack a bit. Recall the 1937 Lankhmar game. Although this game wasn't published in its own right, we can jump forward a little bit to the early 1970s. Here, an individual named David McGarry demonstrated a board game that he'd developed named The Dungeons of Pachacada to one Gary Gygax. At this point a freelancer for Gaiden Games, but later the founder of TSR and a primary author of Dungeons & Dragons. Gygax picked up on the game and approached Fritz Leiber about using Nehwon as a setting for a pair of related games, the Nehwon game covering wilderness adventuring, while McGarry's game covering underground delving. Gaiden Games ultimately did not pick up either concept, but when Gygax had got TSR running, he picked up on both of them, but in a different form to the related duology that he'd originally conceived. McGarry's The Dungeon of Pachacada was published in 1974 simply as Dungeon, and a version of Leiber and Fischer's 1937 game, revised by Gygax, Robert J. Kunst and Brad Stock, arrived in 1976 as Lankhmar. This began a fairly long relationship with TSR and Leiber, and the Lankhmar books were a staple within the influences that Dungeons & Dragons drew upon. You can almost see this directly with the shape of the original thief class and the depiction of a spell that recalls the hallmarks of D&D's magic missile within the opening pages of the Swords of Lankhmar. Our heroes made their debut within the Dungeons & Dragons game within the pages of 1980's Deities and Demigods, which included statistics for the major characters of the books, Nehwon's gods, and a few of its monsters. The setting was given a full workout in 1985 with the release of Lankhmar, City of Adventure. This presented Lankhmar and Nehwon as an official campaign setting for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, and came with a colour poster map of the city itself, a work of sheer beauty. This map is something I very much continue to appreciate today. An innovation of the map was to include various blank areas, into which city geomorphs, or areas of a dungeon master's own devising, could be inserted. Not only that, they could be changed around to give some representation of the changing nature of Lankhmar, where areas get rebuilt after being destroyed for some reason, say a couple of heroes not being so careful with their fireboxes. The campaign book also included a number of NPC summaries drawn from the novels, and rule alterations to the AD&D core. 2 adventures, CA1, Swords of the Undercity, and CA2, Swords of Deceit, were released in 1985 and 1986 to support it. Lankhmar received better support under the second edition of AD&D. In 1993, a revised version of City of Adventure was released. This revision brought material in from the Knight and Knave of Swords, which hadn't been published at the time of the first edition City of Adventure, but also made greater reference back to Leiber's works within the information it presented. For example, the entry for Elakiria, as well as providing more fleshed-out statistics than before, includes an indicator noting that she appears in the Swords of Lankhmar. These references can be very useful when bringing NPCs to life in-game. The maps provided for this edition are pretty much the same. More importantly, several additional works were released for 2nd edition AD&D in support of the city adventure. An adventure series formed from LNA 1, Thieves of Lankhmar, LNA 2, Nehwon, and LNA 3, Prince of Lankhmar. 2 adventure compilations in NLR 1, Wonders of Lankhmar, and LNR 2, Tales of Lankhmar. 2 manhunt chase scenarios in the form of LNQ1, Slayers of Lankhmar, and the uncoded Avengers of Lankhmar, or Avengers in Lankhmar. And 2 volumes that add even more flesh onto the bones of the city. Rogues in Lankhmar, covering the Plaza and Tenderloin districts, and Cutthroats of Lankhmar, covering the Mercantile, Festival, Park, Cache, and River districts. One final look at Lankhmar in Dungeons & Dragons came in 1996, with the New Adventures of Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser starter game. This box gave you a basic set of AD&D rules, an overview of the setting, and a colour poster map of Lankhmar and one of Nehwon, different to those previously published. The Lankhmar poster map in this set is more artistic than that of the previous City of Adventure volumes, but lacks the geomorph spaces, which are nonetheless included in the Adventure Cookbook section of the set in its district-by-district view of the city. Following the publication of 3rd edition D&D, it didn't seem as Wizards of the Coast were interested in Lankhmar, leaving the potential for gaming open to others to pick up. And this they did, with Mongoose Publishing bringing Lankhmar to their iteration of the RuneQuest game, with Lankhmar in 2006 and Nehwon in 2007 for Mongoose 1st edition RuneQuest. This was updated in 2nd edition Mongoose RuneQuest, with Lankhmar Unleashed in 2009. As Lankhmar sourcebooks, the Mongoose books don't come close to the City of Adventure volumes, but in many ways, the RuneQuest game system does suit the more low-magic, gritty setting. Pinnacle Entertainment were next up to the plate for Lankhmar in 2015, with the release of Lankhmar City of Thieves for the Savage Worlds role-playing game. A handful of releases came out to support the setting here, including Savage Tales of the Thieves Guild, Savage Foes of Nehwon, and Savage Seas of Nehwon from 2015 to 2018. While I'm not a fan of the Savage Worlds game, it feels too much like a Lego kit for me. It does a fair job of the Lankhmar setting. Again, the source doesn't really approach that published by TSR, but the maps of Lankhmar and Nehwon that came with the game are just sumptuous. Finally, and currently, Lankhmar is presented as a setting for Goodman Games' Dungeon Crawl Classics role-playing game. The core box set provides rules modifications to the Dungeon Crawl Classics game, source material for the setting, a referee screen, and DCC Lankhmar Adventure 0, No Small Crimes in Lankhmar. The maps within the set are reminiscent of the original TSR ones, and the rules too feel like you're back in 1985 wandering the streets of the city of the Black Toga. It's a good set, but again, having those old TSR volumes to hand will just make it better. The DCC Lankhmar line is continuing, as of the date of this video, with the latest adventure, DCC Lankhmar 13, Treachery in the Beggar City, released in August of 2022. In many ways, Lankhmar as a gaming setting has almost found its spiritual home there. The setting itself can be broken into 2 distinct parts, Nehwon and Lankhmar. It is a reasonably low magic, but definitely not no magic setting, and the focus is largely about swords against sorcery rather than swords and sorcery. More often than not, magic and magicians form obstacles to be overcome, more so than a practical tool characters might use to overcome them. With its abundance of dark alleyways, the setting, particularly Lankhmar itself, lends itself more to swashbuckling and thieves than to knightly paladins, holy clerics and wizards. This can be seen in the rule adaptations both Dungeons & Dragons and Dungeon Crawl Classics have made to the core systems in order to mesh with the setting, something that RuneQuest and Savage Worlds didn't particularly find a need to do. The 2 parts of the setting can be viewed like this. Lankhmar is very urbane. It's a city of vices, thieves, merchants, extortionists and assassins. Through the various supplements for the different systems that have covered it, it is very well mapped out, and this is necessary for tracking player characters through its maze-like streets and making the place live as, effectively, a character in and of itself. It is not good enough to hand-wave travel through its passages. Players must become familiar with its twists and turns, and every corner and junction passed through may become a short adventure, or an encounter, or a scene, or whatever, that can often springboard into side quests and plot hooks that can be picked up later in the campaign. Within the works of fantasy, Lankhmar stands as somewhat of a prototype for other great role-playing game cities such as Greyhawk, Waterdeep, Sanctuary and Tollus. But only Lankhmar, with its game material and the evocative writings of Fritz Leiber, really nails the atmosphere. As for Nehwon, it is less fleshed out in the main, except in really broad brushstrokes. It has some unique features that are fairly well described. Ilthmar, the mountainous region around Stardock, and Rime Isle, for example. While, as with any outdoor setting, it is possible to build in as much detail as desired, the best use of Nehwon, in my opinion, is as a backdrop to travel through when visiting places beyond Lankhmar as the adventurers require. This is reflected both in the gaming source material published for Nehwon itself, largely short summaries with a few points of detail, and within Leiber's novels. Take, for example, the novel The Swords of Lankhmar. This begins in Lankhmar, touches base with a few regions beyond, and then ends in Lankhmar. In ways, this makes it the antithesis of Lankhmar itself. Where Lankhmar benefits from detail, Nehwon benefits from vagueness, and hand-waving travel within it is a perfectly acceptable and logical thing to do. For those familiar with the Points of Light campaign construct, Nehwon is a good example, with Lankhmar itself being the brightest of those points. In basic summary, a Lankhmar campaign is largely urbane, swashbuckling and low magic and should be laced with a good dose of cynicism and dark wit. A Lankhmar campaign is not wizards galore, dragons, knights in shining armour, and priests calling down the powers of their deities to smite their foes. You won't find dwarves, elves, orcs and dragonborn here, but that is not to say that it is devoid of the fantastical within its magically living buildings, invisible folk, people with invisible flesh but opaque bones, and the monstrous threats of many kinds. Especially rats. Never underestimate the rats. If you love cities as a gaming setting, Lankhmar is perhaps one of the best ones out there. If you want some down and dirty swashbuckling without so many pointy ears and cat people in your game, absolutely. If you want to see your player characters live by their wits and not relying so much on the mass destruction wrought by magic users and the divine walking hospitals of clerics to patch them up afterwards, certainly. Lankhmar gives you the opportunity to delve into the swords and sorcery origins of many of the games that we play. Given that Leiber was one of the authors that touched base with H.P. Lovecraft, and some of the adventures of Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser do have Lovecraftian overtones, the setting functions well in a sort of fantasy medieval form of Call of Cthulhu. The works of Clark Ashton Smith are also of a similar feel, even to the point of parallels between Gaspard du Nord's conflict against the Colossus of Liorne on the walls of Vion's cathedral, and the Grey Mouser's own tolling of the bell atop the Temple of the Gods of Lankhmar towards the close of the Swords of Lankhmar. If all that stirs you, then Lankhmar is certainly for you. If not, perhaps it isn't. Whichever way, the place of Leiber and Lankhmar in the annals of the development of the RPG hobby is a firmly cemented thing.